Think about everything you own for a moment. The bicycle parked in your hallway, the sofa you're sitting on right now, the toys scattered across your living room floor, the car sitting in your driveway, the phone in your hand, the clothes on your back. At some point, almost certainly, every single one of those things crossed an ocean. Packed into a steel container, stacked dozens of rows high on a vessel the length of 4 football fields, navigating thousands of miles of open water before arriving at a port, being unloaded, and making its way to a warehouse, a truck, a store, and eventually your home. That is the invisible architecture of modern life, the system that makes global trade possible. The network of ships and shipping lanes and ports and containers that quietly delivers the entire material world to our doorsteps, and that most of us never think about for a single second. But here is the thing that should make you think about it. Those ships, the ones carrying your furniture, your electronics, your groceries, your car parts, were almost certainly built in China. The containers stacked on their decks were almost certainly made in China. And increasingly, the companies that own and operate those vessels have deep and direct ties to China as well. China does not just participate in global shipping. China dominates it, controls it, shapes it in ways that have profound implications not just for trade economics, but for the balance of global power itself. And now, the United States, the country that once ruled the world's oceans, that built the ships that won the Second World War, that projected its power and its values across every major sea lane on the planet, is waking up to just how completely it surrendered that dominance. And it is scrambling, urgently and not entirely coherently, to figure out what to do about it. Welcome to Frontline Reports. I'm Nico. Today we are telling the full story of how China became the undisputed master of global shipbuilding, how it built that dominance methodically, strategically, and with enormous government backing over several decades. What that dominance means for the economics of global trade and the security calculations of every major power. And what the United States is now doing, and whether any of it can realistically change a situation that has been decades in the making. Because this is not just a story about boats. This is a story about who controls the arteries of the global economy, and what happens when one country realizes it has quietly lost that control entirely. Before we talk about shipbuilding, we need to talk about shipping, because the scale of what we're discussing is so enormous that most people have genuinely no conception of it. Approximately 90% of everything traded internationally moves by sea, not by air freight, not by rail, not by road, by sea, on ships. The modern container ship, a vessel that did not even exist in its current form until the 1950s, is one of the most consequential inventions in human history. By standardizing cargo into uniform metal boxes that can be seamlessly transferred between ships, trucks, and trains, containerization unlocked a level of global trade efficiency that simply was not possible before. It made the modern global supply chain possible. It is, in a very real sense, the physical infrastructure on which the entire contemporary global economy rests. The numbers are staggering. The global shipping fleet currently comprises tens of thousands of vessels. The largest container ships in the world, the ultra-large container vessels now being deployed by major shipping lines, are over 400 meters long, can carry more than 24,000 standard containers, and represent investments of hundreds of millions of dollars each. Every major economy on Earth depends on the system. Every supply chain threads through it. Every product that moves between continents passes through ports where these vessels dock, load, and unload. The global shipping industry is not a peripheral sector of the world economy. It is the world economy's circulatory system. And China today controls an extraordinary portion of that system. Not just the ships themselves, though China's dominance in shipbuilding is, as we will explore in detail, comprehensive and growing. But the containers, the port infrastructure, the shipping companies, the components and parts, the steel, the financing, the entire ecosystem that makes commercial shipping function. This did not happen overnight. It is the result of decades of deliberate state-directed industrial strategy, one of the most successful examples of government-guided economic development in modern history, and one of the most consequential strategic shifts in the global balance of power since the end of the Cold War. Let's start with the raw numbers, because they are genuinely extraordinary. As of the most recent industry data, approximately 34% of all the ships currently sailing the world's oceans were built in Chinese shipyards. More than 1 in 3 vessels on the water today, container ships, bulk carriers, tankers, car carriers, and others, emerged from a Chinese facility. But the more telling figure concerns the future, not the present. Roughly 57% of all ships currently under construction, the vessels that will define the composition of the global fleet for the next decade and beyond, are being built in China. China is not just dominant today. It is building a dominance that will become even more complete as older vessels are retired and the new order books are delivered. To put the historical trajectory in perspective, China's share of global ship production was less than 5% in 1999. By 2023, it had risen to over 50%. In less than a quarter century, China went from a minor player in shipbuilding to producing more than half the world's commercial vessels. That is one of the most dramatic industrial transformations in modern economic history, and it extends far beyond the ships themselves. China today produces approximately 95% of the world's shipping containers. The steel boxes that physically carry the world's goods, that make global trade as we know it possible, are made almost entirely in China. There is simply no comparable manufacturing capacity for containers anywhere else on Earth. The comparison with the United States is almost painful in its starkness. One Chinese state-owned shipbuilder, a single company, now launches more vessels by total tonnage every year than all of America's shipyards have produced combined since the end of the Second World War. Not since last year. Since 1945. 80 years of American shipbuilding output exceeded annually by a single Chinese competitor. Between 2020 and 2022, China had more than 4,000 large ocean-going ships on its order books. The United States had 12. In 2024, the U.S. accounted for just 0.01% of global commercial ship production, a fraction of a fraction. The Center for Strategic and International Studies, one of Washington's most respected think tanks, has documented these figures in detail, and the picture they paint is unambiguous. America has not just fallen behind in shipbuilding, it has effectively exited the industry. Understanding how China achieved this dominance requires going back to the early 2000s, a period that, in retrospect, was the turning point in the modern history of global shipbuilding. The story begins with China's accession to the World Trade Organization in 2001. Entry into the WTO opened China's economy to the full force of global trade and simultaneously generated enormous new demand for ships. As Chinese exports began flowing to markets around the world in unprecedented volumes, and as imports of raw materials to feed China's industrial expansion surged in return, the need for shipping capacity grew dramatically. Beijing recognized this moment and responded with characteristic strategic clarity. In the country's 10th five-year plan, the central government's blueprint for economic development, shipbuilding was explicitly identified as a priority sector. The plan laid out a vision for growing both China's port infrastructure and its domestic ship production capacity, positioning shipbuilding as a strategic industry rather than simply a commercial one. This was not an accident of market forces. It was a deliberate policy choice. And the foundations for success were already in place. China had, by the early 2000s, built formidable capacity in heavy manufacturing. Its steel industry, the backbone of shipbuilding, was already among the world's largest and most productive. It had the raw materials, the processing capacity, and the industrial infrastructure to produce the steel beams, plates, and structural components that ships require in enormous quantities. More importantly, China had labor. Not just cheap labor, though the cost advantage was real and significant, but a large, increasingly skilled, increasingly educated workforce capable of performing the sophisticated work that modern shipbuilding demands. Building a large commercial vessel is not simple manufacturing. It requires precision engineering, complex systems integration, skilled welding and fabrication, and the coordination of thousands of workers across an enormous facility. China had, in growing quantities, all of these things. The government then added the critical accelerant, direct, and indirect support for the shipbuilding sector on a scale that no privately funded competitor could match. Between 2010 and 2018 alone, China's government provided an estimated $132 billion in direct financial support to its shipbuilding industry. That figure, already staggering, does not include the additional layers of support provided through state-owned banks offering preferential loan terms, debt forgiveness arrangements for struggling yards, and equity infusions into strategically important shipbuilders. The economic logic was sound. Shipbuilding is what economists call a learning curve industry. The more ships you build, the better and cheaper you become at building them. Each vessel produced generates knowledge, process improvements, workforce skills, and supply chain efficiencies that make the next vessel easier and less expensive to produce. Scale drives cost reduction. Cost reduction enables more orders. More orders generate more scale. Once China's shipbuilding industry crossed the threshold of genuine global competitiveness, the reinforcing cycle became self-sustaining. Government support created the initial capacity. Scale created cost advantages. Cost advantages attracted orders. Orders created more scale. And so on, year after year, until China had built a position that competitors found nearly impossible to challenge. The result is a cost differential that defines the economics of the entire industry. A standard large container ship built in China costs approximately $55 million. The estimated cost of building a comparable vessel in the United States is around $330 million. That is a price difference of 6 to 1. 6 times more expensive to build in America than in China. That single number explains more about the current state of global shipbuilding than almost anything else. To appreciate how far the United States has fallen, you need to understand where it once stood. American shipbuilding's finest hour came during the Second World War. Faced with the existential challenge of supplying Allied forces across 2 oceans, while German submarines hunted convoys in the Atlantic and Japanese naval power threatened the Pacific, the United States mobilized its industrial capacity in ways that remain, honestly, almost incomprehensible in their scale and speed. The Liberty Ship program is the most celebrated example. These were standardized cargo vessels, designed for rapid, efficient mass production rather than elegance or sophistication, that were built in American shipyards at a pace that staggered the imagination. By the end of the war, American yards had produced more than 2,700 Liberty ships, along with thousands of other military and commercial vessels. The industrial capacity that this effort created, the shipyards, the workforce skills, the supply chain relationships, the manufacturing knowledge, was enormous. For a time after the war, American shipbuilding remained a major global force. But the economics of peacetime commerce are fundamentally different from those of wartime necessity. Without the government contracts and patriotic urgency that had driven wartime production, American yards faced a difficult transition. And as the global economy recovered and other nations rebuilt their industrial capacity, competition intensified. By the 1970s, Japan had become the world's dominant shipbuilding nation. Its yards were more efficient, its workers equally skilled, and its government actively supported the industry in ways that American policy did not match. By the 1980s, South Korea had entered the picture, bringing its own combination of government support, industrial discipline, and competitive cost structures. By the 2000s, China was joining this Asian triumvirate. American shipbuilding, meanwhile, was following the broader trajectory of American manufacturing. As the U.S. economy shifted toward services, toward finance, technology, healthcare, retail, and professional services, the share of employment in manufacturing shrank steadily. Today, manufacturing accounts for just 8% of total employment in the United States. The industrial workforce, the supply chains, the manufacturing culture, and the institutional knowledge that shipbuilding requires have eroded over decades of gradual deindustrialization. Rebuilding them is not simply a matter of writing checks. It requires reconstructing an entire industrial ecosystem: the specialized steel suppliers, the precision fabricators, the trained welders and pipe fitters and marine engineers, the port facilities, the regulatory frameworks, and the management expertise that once existed but has been allowed to decay over half a century of neglect. Against this backdrop, the Trump administration has announced what it describes as a commitment to reviving American shipbuilding. The rhetoric has been sweeping and unequivocal. "We are going to resurrect the American shipbuilding industry," President Trump declared, including commercial shipbuilding and military shipbuilding. The ambition is clear. The mechanism chosen to pursue it is more complicated, and honestly, considerably more controversial. The administration's primary tool for generating both revenue for the industry and pressure on Chinese competitors is a new fee structure imposed on Chinese-built, Chinese-owned, and Chinese-operated ships that dock at American ports. The fees are substantial, starting at $1 million per port call and potentially rising to $3.5 million depending on the vessel's ownership and construction history. They represent a significant additional cost for any shipping company that relies on Chinese-built vessels and wants to maintain access to American ports. The policy goes further still. Ship owners with any Chinese-built vessels in their fleets, not just ships making calls at American ports, but any Chinese vessel anywhere in an operator's global fleet, may also face these additional charges. This dramatically expands the reach of the policy beyond vessels directly serving American trade. The stated logic is straightforward. The fees would generate revenue that could be directed towards subsidizing and rebuilding domestic shipbuilding capacity. They would simultaneously make Chinese-built ships more expensive to operate in American trade, potentially shifting orders toward vessels built in allied countries, South Korea and Japan, both of which maintain substantial and sophisticated shipbuilding industries. But the reaction from the shipping industry has been sharp, and the concerns raised are not trivial. One prominent industry analyst went so far as to characterize the proposed fee structure as a potential trade apocalypse, not a term deployed casually by people whose professional livelihood depends on measured, careful analysis of industry trends. The concern is this: because Chinese-built ships dominate the global commercial fleet, fees imposed on those vessels do not primarily hurt Chinese companies. They primarily hurt the shipping companies, many of them based in Europe, Asia, and elsewhere, that have built their business models around the cost economics that made Chinese ships so attractive in the first place. And those companies, facing dramatically higher costs for calling at American ports, have an obvious response available to them. They can simply route around the United States. If the cost of calling at an American port rises by millions of dollars per visit, shipping companies will run the economic calculations, and some will conclude that the volume of American trade doesn't justify those costs. They will reorganize their routes to minimize or eliminate American port calls, transshipping goods through ports in Canada, Mexico, or elsewhere, and moving them to American consumers by road or rail rather than by direct ship. The distribution consequences could be significant. Supply chains that currently rely on direct maritime delivery would have to be redesigned. Goods that currently arrive by ship at American ports would travel by more expensive and less efficient land routes. The additional costs, and there would be additional costs, would ultimately land somewhere, most likely on American consumers, in the form of higher prices for imported goods. That is going to drive up the cost of goods, one industry expert noted plainly. Costs on the whole will go up as a result of this policy. Even setting aside the market disruption that aggressive port fees might cause, the fundamental challenge of rebuilding American commercial shipbuilding is immense. And understanding why requires grappling honestly with the economics of the industry. Shipbuilding is one of the most capital-intensive manufacturing sectors in existence. Building a single large container ship requires billions of dollars of specialized equipment, enormous physical facilities, and thousands of skilled workers over months or years of construction. The upfront investment required to establish a genuinely competitive shipbuilding operation, not a small-scale facility producing a handful of specialized vessels, but a yard capable of competing with China's mass production capacity, is staggering. It is also labor-intensive in ways that distinguish it from many other manufacturing sectors. Shipbuilding cannot be fully automated. It requires skilled human hands, welders who can work in confined spaces, pipe fitters who can navigate complex systems, marine engineers who can integrate propulsion, navigation, and cargo systems with precision. These skills take years to develop and require a training pipeline that does not currently exist at the scale America would need. And it requires a supply chain ecosystem. Not just the shipyard itself, but the specialized steel producers who supply marine-grade plate, the manufacturers of marine engines and propulsion systems, the makers of navigation and communications equipment, the producers of the thousands of specialized components that a modern ship contains. In China, that entire ecosystem exists, is deeply developed, and benefits from the same scale economics as the shipyards themselves. In the United States, much of it has atrophied or disappeared entirely. The honest assessment from economists who study industrial policy is that rebuilding this ecosystem from its current state to genuine global competitiveness would require sustained government support on a scale that makes the policy conversation complicated, particularly for an administration whose broader ideological commitments lean toward market primacy rather than industrial subsidies. If the United States wants to go in that direction, one analyst observed, it would have to provide some kind of subsidies to make it commercially viable. You are effectively going to have to subsidize an industry that isn't going to make any money, and it is going to cost the taxpayer money. The 6-to-1 cost difference between Chinese and American shipbuilding doesn't just reflect labor costs or regulatory differences. It reflects decades of accumulated scale, supply chain depth, workforce skills, and production efficiency that cannot be replicated quickly. Even with significant government support, closing that gap would take years. And during those years, the U.S. shipbuilding industry would be producing vessels at prices that the market, absent strong protection or mandate, would not choose to pay. This creates the fundamental dilemma at the heart of the Trump administration's shipbuilding ambitions. The tools available, tariffs and port fees on Chinese ships, subsidies for domestic production, can move the needle. But moving it from 0.01% of global production to anything approaching genuine competitiveness in commercial shipbuilding is a multi-decade project requiring sustained political will, consistent policy, and enormous public investment. None of those things can be guaranteed in a political environment that changes every 4 years. Here is where the conversation shifts, and where the stakes become considerably higher than the economics of freight rates and shipyard employment. The Trump administration's push to revive American shipbuilding is not primarily motivated by the desire to make the U.S. commercially competitive in the global shipping market. That would be a worthy but essentially commercial goal. The actual driver is something more fundamental: national security. And the security argument, when you hear it stated plainly, is genuinely difficult to dismiss. The United States military's global power projection capacity depends entirely on the ability to move enormous quantities of equipment, supplies, personnel, and materiel across oceans. Tanks, artillery, ammunition, fuel, food, medical supplies, all of it has to travel by sea to reach theaters of operation in Europe, the Pacific, the Middle East, or anywhere else American forces might need to operate. For this, The U.S. military depends on a combination of its own naval vessels and commercially contracted cargo ships. And those commercial vessels, an increasing proportion of them, are built in China, owned by companies with Chinese connections, and operated using Chinese-manufactured components and containers. In a serious conflict scenario, particularly one involving China itself, over Taiwan or in the South China Sea, the implications of this dependence are not abstract. A country that cannot build its own ships is a country that cannot guarantee its ability to supply its own military forces if its access to foreign-built vessels is disrupted. A country whose commercial shipping fleet is dominated by vessels built and partly owned by a potential adversary is a country with a profound strategic vulnerability sitting in plain sight. Doesn't it seem like a problem that the United States cannot build ships on its own? One security analyst put it directly. And doesn't it seem like a problem that we are dependent on Chinese-built ships to move goods around for the United States? These are not rhetorical questions. They are genuine strategic concerns that have been raised by military planners, defense analysts, and security-focused policymakers across the political spectrum. The concern predates the Trump administration and will likely outlast it regardless of what happens in the next election cycle. The geopolitical dimension extends further still. Control over global shipping routes has historically been one of the foundations of great power influence.